Hello and welcome to Lesson 7 of 21 for 21. 21 lessons for sports media in the 21st century. I'm Stuart, and joining me today, as always, is Jamie Coles.
Hey Stuart, how are we doing?
All good, thanks. And yourself?
Yeah, grand. And today we are very excited to be joined by commentator in the MotoGP World Championship, the co-host of the official MotoGP podcast, Matt Dunn, because today we're
Hi.
talking about everything podcasting and obviously in the world of sport. So I thought Matt would be kind of like the perfect guest, as he knows all about sports podcasting in that sense.
I don't know about perfect, but thank you very much anyways.
So the reason that we decided to talk about podcasting today, and Stuart and I talked about this a few weeks back, is that this is the 7th episode of our podcast. And there's this kind of notorious fact that podcasts, podfade, they call it podfading, podcasts disappear in and around the 7th episode of a podcast. And apparently the 7th episode is kind of a good marker of whether a podcast is going to run its duration or not. Obviously, if a podcast series is only planned for 6 or 7 episodes, then it's not necessarily pod fading. But there's I was looking it up earlier, and I think there's something like 75% of all podcasts are inactive. They disappear after a very short period of time.
Wow, I didn't know that.
I mean, we spoke on episode 1. We joked that we'd given ourselves by calling our podcast 21 for 21, we'd sort of half already given ourselves a 21 episode target, which, I mean, to be honest, Jamie, I think that's been helpful, because if we hadn't already set ourselves such a high number, we might some weeks have skipped it, or some weeks have been less motivated to get things done. So just purely by giving ourselves this name, it has helped us find our rhythm. Would you agree?
I think so, yeah. So let's go over to Matt then and talk about your role as the podcast co-host. You're actually the co-host of the official MotoGP podcast with Fran Wild, who was on a few weeks back for Lesson 5. She had her kind of like PR hat on for the MotoGP World Championship, and she talked about the official MotoGP fan tokens and NFTs. We didn't get into podcasting with her, but we brought you on to fill that bit. So just maybe a little bit, what's your kind of role in podcasting? It's been going on for a couple of years now. Just give us a bit of an overview of the MotoGP official podcast.
This year's a little bit different than it was on previous years, in that this is like the kind of incarnation of what it was always meant to be in its 3rd year running finally. So it's one podcast per race, because we only get time on Thursdays to record it. We interview a rider, team manager, crew chief, some special guests. Last time we had VIPs on. Just do a 25 to 30 minute interview about either a given topic or like potentially their life story if it's not really been told all that much before, people aren't so familiar with it. Myself and Fran, we do an intro and outro where on previous occasions we've tried to like have a more discussion based intro and outro, but then on some of the episodes lately, due to a variety of reasons, from like filming time constraints and things like that, and our own personal time constraints of our next task for the day, because it's not our only job, we just get into we just have the interview, here's your interview, enjoy it, bye, that sort of thing. But one podcast per GP, which this year there are 19 Grands Prix, 19 race weekends, so 19 odd podcast episodes in a year. And we share like a lot of the duties from making the request to the guest, writing out the interviews, decide the topics, to then sort of doing the transcriptions and promotional plan, which we give to our colleagues in like the social media and web departments to promote it on MotoGP.com and the MotoGP social channels.
Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit, because we want to talk to you about the kind of the marketing of podcasts, and the sort of distribution of podcasts. So you don't have like a big production team behind you. I kind of thought like the MotoGP World Championship official podcast, I thought, maybe you'd have a handful of people that were kind of helping you out, but it's very much owned by yourself and Fran.
Well, insofar as like the decision on who the guests are, the topics and everything like that, we're basically completely sort of independent. In other years we've had input because we've had like a sponsor on board for certain segments and things like that, or we ask the help of the necessary people if we want other guests on specifically, like we did for the guests that we had in the Americas in the race we had in Texas the other week. obviously there's the production this year's massively sort of stepped up in terms of the production value they've placed on the podcast. So they want to make sure they've given Dawn as a production company the image is right, and it's beautifully shot. We got some very nice Sony cameras, some good microphones. We make sure the set's right. A lot of thought goes into the location of where it is and what you can see, because of course you have to. If you've got a rider on, you don't want another rival team in the background of the shot, even if you've got quite a nice blurred high depth of field background, things like that. So things like that go into it, but that's more on the day and about an hour leading up to the podcast shooting itself. Everything else is very much, me and Fran deciding it.
Okay, so these are still on site for each race. You're following the riders and the teams each weekend then.
Yeah, exactly. So we both have our own individual jobs. It's like Jamie mentioned, I do a bit of commentary and then podcast, and then a couple of other things like shooting some long form series or some social media videos. So I'm sort of a part of the production team that does that. So all of our jobs together, we travel to all races throughout the season. Fran does the PR and communications. You heard from her about her job in the other episode. So then, the podcast being part of that. Thursday's the media day, the day to do it. So that's how it gets going.
Okay, so there's a few things I want to go down the route here, but
we got time.
Let's start with why podcasting. Why would a MotoGP World Championship, that essentially the primary business is broadcasting races on TV, right? Why would they decide to do a podcast? What was the kind of the motivation behind that?
I think in the beginning it was because it's it's a trend on social platforms and digital storytelling, right? So everyone's starting to do mini documentaries and things like that. So therefore people were doing that, producing those sorts of things. And then with podcasting, well, that's the latest thing. So we have to find a way to jump into this aspect of storytelling, because in the MotoGP audience, the broader MotoGP audience, there's going to be people who like to listen to podcasts, and maybe they want to hear a long form interview with Joan Mir, the MotoGP world champion from last year. There are people who love Drive to Survive style F1 documentaries. So, maybe you should start producing mini documentaries, or perhaps sign up for a series that someone else is producing, spoiler, or something like that. Or then perhaps you want
Nick Lankey
social videos.
We talked about that on episode 4, I think. We talked about the Netflix series.
We might have already spoiled it, so don't worry.
And we might have already hinted that there may be a MotoGP. It's interesting coming from you, though, the man inside the paddock. So,
well, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to see all the extra film crews around and everything like that. But yeah, so there's an audience for it, and so you got to tap into that, because essentially, at the end of the day, if you're looking at it from a value to the company perspective, not just there's direct monetary value in obviously doing a podcast, bringing a sponsor on board, partners, maybe your AdSense if you're posting the video on YouTube, that there's direct money coming in there, or you are potentially tapping into a new audience if you're able to. It depends on what the direction is, and we've constantly play around with the direction. I think sometimes it can be not a tug of war, but like we all have our ideas and of what direction the podcast should go into, because there is obviously the potential with the podcast. You can do one on MotoGP and we could talk about tires and all that stuff, but that doesn't appeal to a broader audience. So there's always the potential, if you talk around general topics, things like mental health and generic sporting stories, you can break out into a wider audience. If it gets recommended, funny story, if the podcast covers generic topics and then it gets picked up by this person who recommends it to that person, suddenly the algorithm clicks into gear, and then the next thing you know, you're the number one podcast in India for a week, like we were, because Lynn Jarvis, the boss of Yamaha MotoGP, talked about how he loves going to India or something like that. And so you're breaking into a new audience. So I guess in a very long-winded roundabout way, that's why a company gets into it, as direct monetary value, either direct income from that new dynamic of storytelling, or it helps build a bigger audience, which can indirectly, they might subscribe to MotoGP.com or watch MotoGP races on their given broadcaster.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting there. So essentially, what we've been saying is a rights holder such as MotoGP, they can't not have a podcast in this day and age, because like you say, it ticks off. If you're a fan of MotoGP and podcasting, great. If you're a fan of MotoGP and other different forms, you can still get that from from the podcasting. So it certainly is key. Do you think will there be plans to do more than one per race? And if, as you say, there's such a broad topic you can include, would there be maybe a Thursday interview episode, a Monday review episode, or a history episode, or is there anything like that in the pipeline? Maybe.
No, absolutely no plans whatsoever. But like, I'm always talking about ideas. I can't stop thinking about ideas and things we could do. Jamie knows what I'm like from working with me, and it's the same with a lot of the other guys who work in the social media and the digital departments. Like, you could do a podcast which is like shot in the Barcelona offices where it's based, where it's just someone doing a chat show about old races or telling stories. The original form of the podcast in 2018 was a mix. It was episodes we produced in the it was two types, wasn't it? It was like a feature episode, which was either freshly shot interviews with people, which is kind of the current format, or we in fact used old interviews that haven't been released in full, and me and Fran would add like narration to contextualize those interviews. And then on a race weekend, we would shoot one which was like a short interview plus a roundup of what happened in the racing. We had a special guest who was a former MotoGP rider called John Hopkins. I think the possibilities are endless. It's just down to like each individual company, their ethos on what is the most important form of storytelling and basically consumable video that they want to put out into the world. Is podcasting their thing at the moment? Great, we're going to have 3 different types of podcasts. I think that's what F1's doing at the moment. They have the feature interview, they have the fan chat one, or do you just want to have the one and then you focus on other things too? It's up to people who are way above my pay grade.
So, I mean, you mentioned it a few times now. You keep saying shooting a podcast.
Yeah.
And when podcast first came out, the whole kind of point was that it was an audio experience. It was like an on-demand radio almost. It was like extra content from radio. And we put this podcast on YouTube as well as Spotify, Apple, Google, wherever else. Hello to you wherever you're listening. And we get a reasonable audience on YouTube as much as we do anywhere else. So this kind of like the move from audio to video is a reflection, I think, of the market in general in sport media, that people don't necessarily want TV and they don't necessarily want the usual kind of short form social media content. And so this kind of middle ground's been found, which is long form interviews in the form of video and audio that you can either listen to on the go or you can sit down and watch on YouTube. So how do you take that into account? I know you talked about kind of finding a nice place to sit and making sure that the rider isn't sitting in front of opposition branding or whatever. But like, to me, that as a storyteller like yourself, it adds an extra dimension. There's things you can do on video that you can't do on audio, as well as having its own limitations. What's kind of is there anything conscious you take into account other than the what you see on video? Are there extras you can bring in?
From the starting point, I think the decision to actually shoot a podcast and to have it as a video, I think comes from the fact that there's the biggest myth in social media history was that nobody watches video with sound and they want 10-second videos. No, because that came from these videos have the most amount of views. They have no noise and they're like 10 seconds long. Well, yeah, it's because by the time that you've actually looked up from the video, it's got another view on it because it's, you've watched it again. It's a clip of someone falling over, a cat being cute, a dog doing something, jumping into a pile of leaves, right? But everyone took those. This is why the concept of views is so dangerous, because it's just a click. It's a website click. It means nothing. It doesn't tell you anything about how someone's actually engaged with a piece of content. And everybody just took that around. It's like, well, this is what we need to do. We need to do nothing but 10-second videos with no sound. It's like, no, it's ridiculous. Like, people watch TV still. They binge watch Netflixes. Like, we will watch. I don't know if you guys watch Squid Game and stuff. I'm just into a series now called Made, which is like absolutely fascinating, heart wrenching, and I literally spent now with these episodes. They're like 1 hour each. Like, I do spend my time watching it. I'm not just sat there flicking through TikTok for 10-second episodes. So it comes back to there is the audience out there. So put it out and go and find it. And the second reason why you would shoot it is because it's basically for the promotional aspect of the podcast, because you take the video clips, you can put it on YouTube. It's something for people to watch. Having said that, do I watch podcasts on YouTube? No, I don't. But people do. But that's because that's the way I live my life. I listen to podcasts when I'm on drives or if I'm on a run that's longer than half an hour. that's when I do it. I don't listen to it cycling or anything like that. That's the way I interact with podcasts. But other people, they clearly do like to sit down and either watch people talk, God forbid, they have to stare at my face for half an hour, or they have it on YouTube or whatever because they don't know how to use the Apple Podcast app or Spotify app, and they just leave it there running loud on loudspeakers or something like that. Or they have it in the background whilst they're working cheekily at the office. I'm not here to judge.
Yeah, so back to the on the production side then, Matt. So as you say, because the podcast on YouTube isn't necessarily being watched, it might still being listened to. So
Yeah,
because I'm not as familiar with your podcast as Jamie might be. So on the visuals, it's purely just the interview of you and the team, or do you have graphics showing that riders' stats and their past performance on screen as well?
no, it is just like literally watching. Like people might be watching this. There's a Chiron maybe at the start, which is like me and Fran, and this and that, and that's it really. You could do that. You go all out, but that again is down to the individual production companies' decision on how they allocate resources, whether they want to spend time painting a podcast with lots of lovely footage and make it really beautiful, or if they just have, the people's faces on it and that really.
Yeah.
And again, you kind of run that risk almost. I don't want to call it a risk because there's probably no downside, but you're kind of at that point where it's like, does it go from being a podcast to being kind of like a feature interview, like what could be a piece of TV? It's kind of like, where do you draw these lines? And it is kind of, there are distinctions, I think, in the genre of sort of podcasting and a long form TV interview, or I don't know. I think there are distinctions, and people are drawn to a podcast because it is a podcast, maybe because you expect something in particular when you listen to a podcast.
Yeah, well, I think you've just perfectly demonstrated the difference with that question. You've given like your take on it, and then like sort of framed it as a question, whereas as an interview, a long form interview ready for TV is like a very carefully thought out question, and that's it. And then there may be in the actual cut, there's like a phrase of the question, the only relevant part, and that's it. Or maybe there's no question at all with how some people do it. But it depends on the topics too. And I think what the kind of the person what kind of personality you portray of the interviewee in that sense as well. Like, do you keep in the rough bits of them laughing or like taking a sip of coffee and stuff like that? No, you don't do that in TV. It's polished, whereas podcasting is more raw, isn't it? And I think that's the distinction there really.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, having made TV, there's a lot of pre-production that goes into that. Like, I'm going to ask him about this specific moment, and this is the footage we're going to use that corresponds with that moment. And it's a different way of working. Whereas this podcast, we've done some pre-production. Stuart and I, we've talked about what we're going to ask you, what we'd like you to talk about, but essentially we've all just kind of logged in and we're having a chat, and that's how it's going to go out. And certainly for our podcast, we don't do a lot of editing in terms of these chats. I know there are podcasts that are more polished, but that's the way we've decided to do it. And I think I'm going to kind of like try and steer this now into an actual question rather than just making a point and then leaving it hanging for you to answer like I did before. I think I read that there are 2 million different podcasts as of April 2021. And like I say, 75% of those are inactive and died out around the 7th episode. But within those 2 million podcasts that exist, there's an estimated 48 million episodes, which is like, it's an insane amount of content. So like, I was just trying to, I don't know, like 48 million minutes.
Get some perspective
it's a 1
on how
minute
many of them there are.
episode. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But I think a majority, I would take a guess that a majority of those are people like us that are kind of two guys that have something in common. We both work in sport media, and we kind of said one day, hey, this conversation, other people might like to listen to it. They might not. I don't know. But shall we record this and put it out as a podcast? And the barriers are so low, it's very easy to do that in this kind of low budget. I mean, I got myself like a nicer microphone because I've done various other bits of audio stuff for my work. But essentially, anyone could do a Zoom call, connect with anyone, have a conversation, and upload it to Anchor or YouTube or wherever. Not everyone's got the kind of high production quality that comes with having the official MotoGP podcast. So maybe that's where I want to steer us onto and talk a little bit about this, because for me, talking about lessons in sport media, it's kind of for people that necessarily aren't already in sport media. So it's kind of, what can we do as podcasters to kind of grow and improve. So I'm gonna that's the framing. The question is going to be, what was the podcast that inspired you to get into podcasting?
Not an individual one. Like
Okay.
I always the sort of what I come back to in everything that I ended up learning about social media was there was an entrepreneur called Gary Vee, right? Everyone loves, like, so many people love Gary Vee. Some people absolutely hate the guy. But
So
when
this
I
is Gary
was
Vaynerchuk,
Yeah,
the
so when
the
I was
CrossFit guy.
plunged into my job of social media editor at MotoGP initially, and I realized I had no idea what I was doing because I was 21, and the social media coordinator left like 3 weeks into me starting. I didn't realize I was that horrible. I'm joking. That's not actually the reason why they left. I was literally like, shit, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. So I literally went to Google and Googled best practices for social media in business, best practices in sport, and I found Gary Vee, learned stuff about Twitter and Instagram and algorithms, everything from him. And then I sort of like paying attention to his content and what he's doing. He was starting to go really big on podcasts. And so what, like he was starting to do a podcast every single day. I think he still releases one. And now it's more actually like cuts from keynote speeches he's done, or like from conversations he's had in his vlog that he did, and he just puts them up, and someone either, well, I think now like one of his team actually tends to do like an introduction for it and contextualize it, and it's like, enjoy this. But it used to be in certain shows he would do the introduction and just repurpose pieces of content, right? So seeing sort of how much he was able to plow out so easily, I was like, oh, actually, yeah, podcasts are a good idea. I can't remember the first podcast I listened to. I listen to so many now, of all sorts. I'm not even interested in football, but I listen to a lot of interviews with footballers and football managers to learn things about sports coaching, to apply to motorcycle racing, to learn more about that. But yeah, there was, I mean, I think I don't really know what was the start of it, but there's just, if you just take a dive and actually start listening to them, a variety of things, just type into subjects you're interested in. I'm interested in sports psychology. Just type that in. There's so many. There's the sports psychology podcast, I think there is, which I've listened to a couple of episodes of. Then there's like loads of others which just cover that topic, and you can find all sorts of formats and think like, oh, okay, actually, I'm not very good at doing long form interviews, just me and one other person, but I could do like a magazine show style podcast. I could just do that with a bunch of interviews that I put together, and maybe an intro and outro, that sort of thing. I'm not sure if that answers your question very well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And connecting it to kind of the production side of it as well. That's really interesting. Stuart.
Yeah, no, I think what the question I have from what you were saying is, you are listening to podcasts about your interests, but we must be at are listening to all these podcasts, are they replacing something you used to do? Like, you used to, I don't know, watch a YouTube video or seek out a particular TV show about these interests, or a podcast replaced listening to music in your daily routine almost, or?
Yeah, I'd say actually it replaced watching like vlogs and stuff like that, and
Mhm.
and things like that. I've always watched quite a variety of things. It's just people who I thought did social media very well, like as in built a personal brand well, to learn about building a proper like company brand. So I was like trying to learn how to do that with MotoGP through social media, through its Twitter channels and Instagram channels, and what are the best times to everything from what is a good tone for this brand I'm projecting out there into the world, and then also what are like the best times to post an Instagram story or something like that, or how many Instagram stories should you post. So I started watching vlogs from everybody from Gary Vaynerchuk to thinking of like, there's a estate agent guy called Ryan something in New York, and seeing how he does it, and I listened to a couple of his podcasts just to understand. Basically, everyone's become a media company, right? So I just tried to understand how different industries may turn themselves into a media company. Um, and yeah, so I was watching vlogs, but then because work gets more intense, I started traveling with the World Championship after 2 years. So in my third year, I started traveling full time. I don't have as much time to watch vlogs. So I started listening to the same people on podcasts, and like people that they were listening to. I would listen to Gary V on 3 or 4 other people's podcasts, and that introduced me to this one and that one and that one, and you connect the dots, right? Um, and the thing it's now replaced, which ironically then I'm now replacing kind of with replacing podcasts with, is reading. I've never read. I literally read 2 books this year, and that's more books than I've read in like 10, 12 years. Like, not even joking. I don't think I've really read since school. I like just couldn't set the time aside for it. So podcasting was always my reading. It was learning about a topic that I wanted to invest time in. But it was the most easily consumable way to inject it into my mind, basically.
So would you say, do you have a podcast schedule? Like for me, it's based on, certainly in the lockdowns, each day on my lunch break, I would walk to a different supermarket with a different podcast on each day of the week. But for you, would you just listen at random almost, or do you have your weekly routines with what you listen to?
No schedule, but if I go and visit my parents who live about an hour and a half away from me, I always stick 1 or 2 on there. Like I have a couple of downloaded ready for that. Always have some downloaded for a flight. And then if I'm, like I said earlier, if I'm going on a run that's about 35 to 40 minutes long, I try and run as long as the podcast is. And most of them I listen to about 40 minutes long. So yeah, that's it. But there's no schedule or anything like that. But if I know that I've got one of those 3 activities coming up, I have them rocking and ready to roll.
Is there a particular podcast that you're waiting for that notification for that latest episode?
Not a notification, but I follow the people on Instagram, and so they always have interesting guests, and I take note. I think Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO one has been really interesting since he took the production value up. He actually did a really good episode on how he's built the podcast, because I listened to a few episodes before he took it really seriously, and it was quite good. It was just him like basically reading out his diary, and then he decided after he quit his company or something like that, then went on holiday or like to write his book, and then came back, he decided that I'm going to start interviewing people. Since he started interviewing people and published them weekly, his podcasting's gone through the roof. He also did a no expense spared on his production value too. He wanted like full cinematic cameras. They spent a while thinking about the set. He literally employs like 9 people to do it. But then he's making however X amount of, which I think he says on his podcast, but I can't remember what it was. He always has some really, really good interviewees, and his has crossed over with the High Performance podcast, which is probably my favorite one with Jake Humphrey and Damien Hughes. I started listening to that because of, who do they have on it? Some sports star who was in. Actually, no, that's not true. Jake Humphrey was on Stephen's podcast in lockdown last year when I went for a run, and then Stephen went on their podcast, and so I listened to that, like the Shoe on the Other Foot. And then they started having all these sports stars, and then like really big people. And I've now listened to people give their life story or lessons that I couldn't give a shit about their industry. Like the swimming coach who coached Adam Peaty to his Olympic golds. That was probably one of the best things I've ever heard. I've learned so much more about motorbike racing then I've learned interviewing Moto2, Moto3 riders in 3 years, basically, like from that one person about the mentality of an athlete.
Yeah.
So
sorry, it was a comment more than a question. So I'll make my comment and then you can ask the question. I was just going to say, I think it's a lovely platform to hear from people that you wouldn't otherwise hear from, because they're not spotlight kind of people. And so podcast is a nice way to bring out those people and hear their story in a, maybe they're not spotlight people because they don't want to be in the spotlight, and they're not put on a TV set with makeup and everything. They can just sit down at a microphone or even, not even a microphone, just with their headphones and their phone and chat away. And I think, like you say, these are stories that you wouldn't otherwise hear.
Yeah, true.
I think again that goes back, Jamie, to what we spoke about last week and how low the barriers of entry are into podcasting. That you're right. It's just people having a chat, and hopefully others find it interesting. So, I mean, going forward, Matt, in terms of what we've, as we were at that cursed seventh episode now. So for us to go on to 8 and 9 and throughout. So you mentioned Stephen Bartlett. For him to gain himself longevity, he upped his budget. And I'm not sure if me and Jamie are quite going to go down that route, but are there any other nice ideas you've heard of podcasts that started out as one thing, and then as they found their stride, they moved into something else, like they developed a weekly format or a weekly idea that maybe worked better than what they were doing originally?
I think the other thing that he did was just the consistency, and I've learned that from for our podcast. I don't know about the figures. I've not actually looked at the figures of the MotoGP one lately. I don't know if they've gone up or down. I know on like YouTube they're sort of fairly steady and consistent, same amount of people tuning in each week. But in terms of going forward, I think the consistency, like just either set the biggest tips of things that I've seen and then learned from also another podcast I work on, is make sure there's if you post one, if you can only post 2 a month, make sure it's once every 2 weeks and it's consistent, not one at the start of the month, one at the end of the month, and then another one the next week. Just do it consistently. And then the next thing is like we mentioned before, probably a good time to bring it on is make sure it's videoed. And then take clips of that and create a clips channel on YouTube and post them on there, or the actual main podcast channel if you want. That's so invaluable. That's something which struggled to negotiate with the MotoGP team to do that for the MotoGP podcast, because setting up another official MotoGP YouTube channel is not as simple as it sounds. Like when you consider, the magnitude of that, and it's like 4.8 million subscribers on that to set up, where else do you set up? What else do you set up a channel for? Why isn't there a Moto3 specific channel? Why isn't there a channel for this project that we do? Why is there only a podcast channel? It makes sense to do it, but it's not that simple when you're dealing with a several €100 million company and that. But the clips thing is like the number one thing. It can actually really cause a podcast to explode.
I'm going to chase you a little bit on that. So you mean kind of like take this podcast, for example, which I don't know how long we've been talking now, and chop it up into kind of smaller bits, like I don't know, Matt Dunn's top tips for remaining consistent in podcasting.
Well, don't do that, because no one will watch that one. But but like to think of your that's where the social media, like be learning about what's the best way to get a tweet in front of more people, get more retweets and likes. Try and find ways to connect with as many people as possible. That's what you can do with clips. Instead of doing like Matt Dunn's top tips for podcast success, you'd be like 5 tips for podcast success in sports or something like that. Just really pick your words for searchability and things like that. Sort your tags out. So I did one. So I do one on which is like a series of interviews. It's called the Motorstar podcast. I don't do the interviews or anything like that, but I help the guy who's made it, called Peter Starr, promote it. And he's had a load of motorcycle racing legends on it. I think he's done 30 episodes now. And so for each one, I try and break the episode down into, it was originally 4 clips, but now it's 2 per episode, and put it on this clips channel. And you try and find the best way with this person, what is the most searchable thing about them. And so the breakout clip, for example, like the real story is he did an interview with Ben Spies, a former world superbike champion and a MotoGP race winner. And he's really close friends with a guy called Casey Stoner, who's a 2-time MotoGP world champion, one of the greatest riders ever. And the clip I did was, and it's with the thumbnail as well, I just used a photo that I took of Casey years ago at an event, and then Ben just sort of like looking quite stern as like a screenshot in the thumbnail. And I think like the caption is like, the title was why Casey Stoner was one of the greatest ever, and I factored in the title gets chopped off before you can see the full title on the thumbnails. So like it's why Casey Stoner was one of the greatest ever ... And so people are there's more to the title, but you don't know what it is unless you click on it. And then in the actual thumbnail itself, it says like Ben Spies. It's clearly Ben Spies, and it says like he blew my mind. Something a bit more clickbaity. None of it's untrue. He really did. This is the story about it. And then it just spiraled and spiraled and spiraled. And then you've got the end cards were connected to other videos, so people can go directly to that at the end of that video. You've got a call to action outro at the end of it. And the YouTube algorithm just takes care of itself. It's probably one of the best tools around, I think, in terms of searchability, to be fair.
So I think, Jamie,
we've spoken about, we know we need to do this. We spoke about it on the last episode as well, actually, that we need to kind of make these shorter clips.
It's the single simplest and easiest thing you can do to give yourself the best chance of your podcast growing to levels that you never knew were possible. I really think that. Unless you're like an actual celebrity host and you've got that platform already, if you're trying to build a platform, I genuinely think it's the simplest way to give yourself the best chance of that.
So I think what I was going to say, Jamie, is we could do a clip of every time we mentioned Ibayanos on the podcast. That could be our first sub channel with our small clips.
You could do it like a podcast with whatever his name is, ? Something like that. You're not wrong. Okay, 90% of the people will listen to the first 10 seconds here. It's not a podcast with them and click off, but then you still got the 10% of them, right?
Yeah, we've so there's this and I can't believe we're bringing him up again in this episode. He's one of the top Twitch streamers in the Spanish speaking world. and we've spoken about him on like almost every episode now, just purely out of coincidence because he happened to be in the news for one reason or another about something similar that we were talking to. But he was the kind of the spark that set us off having a conversation that led to us going, should we start a podcast?
Interesting.
So these clips, I want to just, I feel like a dog with a bone almost. And is this a way maybe to access other platforms as well? Because I feel like a 40-second clip of a podcast would lend itself to YouTube Reels or to TikTok, whereas obviously a long form podcast probably isn't the right, that's not the right platform.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've chopped these up and I put them on Instagram and tried to format them perfectly with a friend of mine called Evan, who did the graphics above them. You reformat it in 9:16 aspect ratio, the length of the length tallness of your phone. You can put them on Facebook Watch on a Facebook page if they're under 2 minutes 20. You can put them on Twitter. It goes everywhere. I don't do, due to time constraints, it being a freelance project, my other work and stuff like that, I don't do the Instagram and Twitter so much now. But like the podcast clips thing, I mean, it literally grew from 0 to 3,500 subscribers in about 3 months. And you can see the chipping away, like posted about 30 clips. And then it was like the 31st, which started clicking it on. And then the next ones, YouTube then rewarded posting more and stuff like that by putting it in front of more audience and that. So yeah, it transfers everywhere. It's just, unfortunately, it's have you got the time to do it?
And I think that's probably what leads us to this big question about what is sort of this pod fading, what's it down to? And I think a lot of it comes to time, because that was a big thing that, I don't know, Stuart, if it surprised you, it surprised me that we kind of went, yeah, let's start a podcast. And the first couple of episodes, we sat down and had a chat. And then we spent time finding guests. And then we spent time thinking about like the thumbnail, because the thumbnail seems to be something that's very important. And I'm no graphic designer. I just kind of like hash something together with my very rudimentary Photoshop skills. And before you know it, you're spending a lot of time doing it, even if it's just mental time, that you're not necessarily sitting down doing anything, but you're thinking about it and you're thinking about it. And I'd imagine that a lot of these other 2 million people that have started a podcast in the similar way that Stuart and I have, where they've just gone, should we record this and put it out as a podcast? I imagine that's where the energy fades and we have that pod fading. So you seem very conscious about the way you approach creating the podcast, and probably rightly so, because you've got the resources behind you and it's part of your job and everything else. And I think, in terms of actionable advice, this idea of clipping, it seems to be, you can't rate it highly enough. So what would be your advice then, maybe in terms of content, in terms of the moment that you, or leading up to the moment that you sit down and hit record? Because the Stuart and I, our process, I think, is quite simple. We sort of we send each other headlines and interesting articles over the weeks. And we go, this will make a good episode. This will make a good episode. And then we kind of say, right, for this episode, let's do this. And we'll speak to so-and-so. And we kind of almost, with all this material we've got that's our kind of background, and we sit down and just have a chat about it. I think your process seems a lot more conscious, maybe. What would your kind of advice be to someone that's listening to this and they're either thinking of starting a podcast, or they're a similar point to Stuart and myself in this 7th episode, and they're going, what can I do to improve the quality of my podcast itself?
I think first and foremost, it would be have an honest conversation with yourself about a few things, like how much time can you actually allocate to this, because there's no silver bullet to success or anything like that in anything, let alone podcasting. I think that's why there's so much podcast fatigue, and people do it. I'm going to start a podcast because that's the new thing. It's going to make me rich and all that, whereas actually it's better.
Well, and it's easy as well, right? I keep saying the barriers are so low. Anyone could do a podcast.
Yeah, podcasting is easy. No, it's not. I'm still working on how to do a good interview or an intro and outro. Me and Fran, we debate on what the intro should be like and outro should be like all the time. Because I have my way of thinking we should do it, and then it depends on the time constraints that we've got on that. But actionable, I think, honest conversation with yourself about how much time you can allocate to it, and then also decide what's your podcast going to be about, and then why are people going to listen to it? There's going to be 2 reasons why they listen to it. Either you're an infectious personality that people could listen to talk about anything, in which case you're a bit of a superstar and you'll make it in any kind of form of communication and storytelling platform, or are you bringing value to the listener through the actual, are they going to learn something from this podcast? And those are the sort of, you can have either both, which is great. That is the golden ticket, the silver bullet. If you're both a really infectious and relatable personality that people can listen to all the time, and you also bring value to people, fucking hell, you're onto a win there, mate. but you decide which one of those you are, and then create content around that, and then actual actionable things as well. I mean, if you have your podcast just in and out, one of those things, what do you need? A thumbnail. Or what does the thumbnail actually need? It needs like brand identity. It doesn't need to be each one perfectly accustomed to an algorithm or whatever. The ones I keep, well, for the podcast we're working with Motorstar, we spent a while deciding on what the look would be. It's an image of the the interviewer on that side, and then you got a picture of them in the middle, and you got an American flag in the background because the topic is American legends. It says American legends on it. It says the name. That's it. It's the same format every time. All you need is a brand identity, not the most beautiful piece of thumbnail art you've ever seen, right? It could even just be simple as like the background is orange and it's you two plus the guest. And that's it. All you need is a brand identity. So when people are scrolling through home pages, they can see it, right? It stands out. They know what to look for. And then after that, if you've got, that's your main podcast, if you want to make a clip, you need the clip chopped out in Premiere. Super simple to do. If you can export a podcast with video anyways, you can do that. And then pre-record like a generic outro and create the script for it. It only needs to be 20 seconds. Chuck that on the end, send it out, and that's it. It's actually doing it is very easy. It's not that time consuming, but it is, if it stacks up when you're doing an episode every week or two.
Yeah, so I think what I've been waiting for perhaps is, now we've got over the 7. We've done 7 now, so now we have a bank of content to fall back on. So I guess either me or Jamie, if either of us have a spare Saturday in the coming months, which is perhaps unlikely based on the nature of our work, we could go through the old ones, as Matt says, just cut out a minute. Then we've got our bank of short clips ready to hit the market.
Yeah, but then when you want to take it to the next level and you got another free Saturday, go through all those clips and add the right tags to them and things like that, and spend some time, a few hours learning about titles and thumbnails, what kind of words should be on them, what kind of words are going to be most grabby, which fortunately both your lines of work you is second nature to you anyways. You're a bit of an advantage because that's your day-to-day job to understand those things.
Yeah, definitely. And with it, I feel like we're kind of hanging on this clip thing, but it seems like Matt's just like sold it as such a big thing. It's something I've definitely heard of before. 90% of all active podcasts get 90% of their downloads or listen in the first, I think it's 36 hours or 96 hours of posting it. So I guess kind of going through the back catalogue, as it were, of our 7 episodes, and clipping bits, it's a way of almost like repushing these previous episodes that people might not have already heard. The other thing is that we've now got this back, we've got a bank of episodes. People can now binge our podcast should they want to. Because one of the big, and we spoke about it, Stuart, one of the big like fears was if we start promoting this podcast and people go to our YouTube channel and there's like one lonely episode with its very nice thumbnail.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, people, I don't know, I look at that, if I go to someone's or go to a channel or something and I see there's like not a lot there, it's kind of like, well, like it doesn't inspire me to engage. And maybe that's completely wrong. And so now that I feel like we've got enough material that we could start promoting, what, aside from this kind of clipping, what's your kind of, and I'm interested in what you do with Motorstar as well, what's your way of pushing out the podcast?
What do you mean exactly? Like how to promote it in general?
How to promote it, how to market it, how to make it, get it seen.
So initially what I did is I started the number one thing for the industry we're in with motorcycle racing. You have to have a Twitter account. Like it's non-negotiable. You can, Instagram's great as well, but it's like a bunch of, people who just rehash and steal photos on there and things like that. If you want to actually create a kind of community, you need to go to Twitter because that's where people are most active. So that was the first thing I did, create the Motorstar Twitter account. Peter is the host and creator of the podcast, is an old filmmaker. So he's literally from like the 70s and stuff. He's made like 40 motorcycle films and movies and stuff like this. So he's got a back catalogue of all this old race footage of even like which predates like when Dorner took over the World Championship. So he's got footage of this. He's got flat track racing, which is on the dirt ovals. He's got like road racing clips and stuff like this. So I asked him to do with these guests because he always puts, if he's got footage of them, he's uploaded it digitally and put it in the intro of the podcast or photos of them. I asked him for those photos and then a piece of film, put a watermark on it, and then simply just uploaded it onto Twitter and tagged the people, the journalists, the mega fans that I thought would like it because I see them on my own Twitter profile. I keep tabs on what people do and just tag them nicely, didn't spam them, but just like tag them occasionally. Like, hey, thought you would like this clip from 1976 of Steve Baker winning the race of the year. And next thing you know, it gets retweeted, and then all of a sudden you get 100 retweets. Boom, you got 190 Twitter followers. Like it works. Like, it's super simple, but not everyone is that fortunate to have that backlog of footage ready to go. Therefore, you have to create your own footage through Eclipse, and thus we come full circle.
Yeah, no, it's been certainly really helpful, Matt, and a really great chat of someone who, I mean, me and Jamie we're doing this as a hobby, and I know it's part of your job, but not your only job, like you said. But it's certainly what we can do. Going back to those barriers to entry again, we can certainly use what you're doing professionally on our amateur setup, because it's not difficult. It's like you say, it's getting that content out there, knowing who to target. I think me and Jamie have been using LinkedIn a lot because it's almost like an industry podcast at times. But back to the theme: 21 lessons for the 21st century. Matt, how would you summarize lesson 7 then for our listeners?
What, in terms of how to create a podcast and try to make a success of it?
Yes. What would be the summary, short summary, if you can?
Short summary is decide what your topic, what your theme is. What's your topic? Are you, and everyone knows this deep down already, are you the type of personality that people could listen to talk about anything, or do you want to bring value to people and actually teach them something through your guests or through your knowledge base? Decide which one of those you are and go down that route. Create a YouTube channel, invest in Podbean or whatever podcasting thing you want to download, because it costs money. It's about 100 quid for a year, maybe. YouTube's free. Make a Eclipse channel. Make sure you've got an okay microphone so people can actually hear you properly, and just go for it. Just set up a manageable time frame. Don't jump in and think you can do every week, because every week is such a tall order. After a while, it might feel fine for the first month, but then after that, it's really hard work, especially if you're solo. And be consistent. Try and set up. I think what you guys have done, like 21 lessons in 21 podcasts and stuff, I think is great, because you've got, like, I was thinking about this when you actually did the intro. What if the series is just 21 episodes and you don't do another one after that? That's fine. There's no need to do another after that if you've done it, per se. Like, if you don't want to do any more, maybe you then create a different podcast and a different seat, or it's under the same channel. So that's great. Here's our series of 21 podcasts. There's no reason why a podcast has to run through for 500 episodes if you don't want to. But like, that maybe that could be it. Maybe the end in sight, an end goal is perhaps another tip which is kind of underrated.
Yeah, I think Stuart sort of when we kind of had the initial conversation of hey, this should be a podcast. And don't get me wrong, I've had this like moment with many other people as well, and it's with Stuart, it's gone forward, which I think is great. He said, let's call it 21 for 21, and we'll do 21 lessons, because it's a good amount. Like, it's no small amount, and we've talked about the work that goes into a podcast already, and a weekly one, what's more. But I think it's not that kind of overwhelming amount, and we're 7 episodes in, we're a third the way through. So yeah, I think I would agree with you on that last point. Certainly, in terms of looking forward, it's kind of like there's an end in sight. It's not this kind of I don't know, like, where do I go from here?
Yeah, it's not like a weird. It's not a weekly commitment. So if there wasn't for that 21 challenge, it may be like, I don't want to let Jamie down this week, but also, so a nice 21 is a nice fixed goal. And what we do in episode 22, that'll be a nice thing to worry about in 14 weeks' time.
And maybe actually the last thing you should do is, before planning, depends on what type of person you are, maybe just plan out the whole thing before you even embark on carrying out any interviews or record anything. Maybe you plan it out completely. You learn how to do a bit of graphic design. This is going to be my thumbnail. Really simple. This is what it costs. These are the episodes I'm going to do. Right, I'm going to do it. It's 15 episodes. Let's go. And that's it. And then if you've done those 15, you've reached the end, decide whether you can continue, or maybe it's taken off. Great. And also, don't get caught up in thinking you should have like 1 million followers. If you get, what's the statistic? If you get 1,000 people to spend 100 quid on you in a year, you get 100 grand. Like, you don't need that much in terms of like, obviously we've not talked about monetization previously, but like if you think about building community, what do you need? You need like you need 100 people to spend 30 minutes of their time listening to you talk bollocks per week or per fortnight, then that's a really good listener base already.
Yeah, we've not talked about monetization. It was something Stuart and I sort of discussed at the start of the episode. I feel like we were like restarting everything up now, because I thought that was a nice conclusion. I feel like I'm now following up. But for me, we don't monetize our podcast. Maybe we'll reach a point when we do and it'll happen naturally. But I think trying to go into podcasting to get rich is maybe the wrong idea, because it's a very saturated market. It's very difficult to do so. And I think that would be the wrong way to go about it. Similarly, we don't really talk about how many people have listened or how many people are listening or the viewing figures all that often either. And I think it's a good idea, keep an eye on them, but it's a good idea to not pay too much attention to those.
Yeah.
I mean, we're doing it, Jamie, of course, just for enjoyment, and also because, as Matt says, are you engaging personality, or are you informing your listeners? Hopefully we're slightly engaging, but we are we do know what we're talking about. We do work in this industry, so we do have stories to tell, which is certainly why I'm getting involved each week.
Yeah, I think the best philosophy I take with sort of the analytics side is after every episode gets published of like Motorstar and stuff, I take and also the MotoGP one. First thing I go to look at is I just click on it. You see the views anyway, so you're like, okay, those are the views. And then you look at the comments, what the people are saying. But then with like Motorstar, I'm trying to help promote it to a new level. So I just take notice what's the graph looking like? Is it fairly steady of downloads? So where's the spike? Is there a random spike a couple of days after I published it? Why was that? Then I go and look at the YouTube analytics. Did a video on there kick off a bit more? Did someone tweet about it? Whatever. You can, depending on the platform, find out what happened. But instead of being like, yes, I got 100 downloads this week or something like that, no, just like, have you suddenly all of a sudden got 200 downloads one week when your normal base is 50? That's when you should pay attention. Other than that, just sort of close your eyes and see what happens, basically.
I think that's a lovely way of bringing this to an end. Close your eyes and see what happens.
Yeah, you didn't have to start up the whole thing again. We can still round it way to a nice finish, can't
we? So thank you very much, Matt, for joining us on lesson 7 of 21 for 21. We'll leave all Matt's details in the episode description, so you can follow him and listen to the official MotoGP podcast as well, should you be so inclined. I'd recommend giving it a listen. Absolutely.
Me too.
me three. Thanks a lot then, Matt, for joining us today. And yeah, so for final tip, how do we sign off? Like and subscribe, or what's the best way of finishing?
Subscribe to the 21 in 21 Eclipse channel coming soon to YouTube.
Watch this space.
Sweet.